Thank you. My name is Steve Thompson, and I want to welcome you here this morning. It's my honor to be the chairman of your Oregon Wine Board this year. And I want to welcome you to what is probably going to be our most successful, well, I know it's going to be our most successful symposium ever. I wanted to show you a slide here of our Oregon Wine Board. We have a tremendously talented board this year, and that will be up here. Here we go. We lost three incredible members this year from the board who put in some incredible service over the years. David Beck, Michael Donovan, and Bill Sweat. And it's going to be hard to replace those guys, but I want to assure you that they will continue to be involved in our industry. It's a real tribute to the service that these gentlemen have put into our board, that all three will continue on as vice chairman of one of our committees for the future. On the board this year, we have some great experience. Ellen Britton, our chairwoman emeritus, and Doug Tennell, our vice chairman, are both in their 6th year on the Oregon Wine Board. John Pratt, our treasurer, is in year 3 on the Oregon Wine Board in his 2nd year as treasurer. J.P. Vallot from Sylvan Ridge is on his 5th year in the Oregon Wine Board. Hilda Jones in her 2nd year on the Oregon Wine Board. And then we have 3 newcomers that bring tremendous perspective and experience to our board. Kevin Chambers, Eugenia Keegan, and Jason Tosh. And Kevin likes to remind me that this is his 2nd go-round on the board. So we're excited to have this kind of experience moving forward. As many of you know, there are 3 legs to the Oregon Wine Board mission: to promote marketing, education, and research that will advance our industry. We do this by securing resources and developing skills to keep us in our industry vital and growing. We built a remarkable industry over the last 50 years, a region that stands with any in the world. Yet, to continue that, we need smart investment and research to protect our resources. We need innovative vendors to show us new ideas and bring us new tools. We must arm ourselves with the very best business and marketing acumen that we can. And we need to continue to collaborate and leverage our time together, especially over the next few days. The Oregon Wine Board staff has put together an outstanding program this year. I urge you all to dig deeply into these sessions. Engage with vendors, learn new things, embrace innovation. In between sessions, make sure to engage with our industry community. Developing our sense of community will make us stronger and our wines more valuable on the global stage in the years to come. So I want to introduce to you our presenting sponsor. Matt Peel from Peel Excavating is our presenting sponsor this year. Matt, as many of you know, has done a tremendous amount of good for our industry and invested so much. And I want to bring Matt up here to say a few words. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Matt Peel. The Oregon wine industry is very important to our company. I know most of you because I've worked for most of you. The relationships have allowed us to create a company that has grown to more than 100 employees with well-paying jobs that they and their families are very proud of. I never thought I would be part of something that was so dynamic as the Oregon wine industry has become, and I see no sign of it slowing down. I invite all of you to come to our booth to see what we've been up to and see how we might help you in your future projects. We sponsor the Oregon Wine Symposium in part because it's one way that we can give back to all of you that have given so much to us, and also to help keep Peel Excavating at the top of your list. I appreciate all of you for coming here today, and I hope you feel your time will be well spent. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you, Matt, for that. If you haven't yet met or you don't know Matt and Julie Peel, the extent of their involvement in our industry is absolutely tremendous, from, gosh, just about every growers meeting around the state to every charitable undertaking that is important to what we do. And there was a vivid reminder of another dimension of their involvement in our business yesterday in a meeting with the Oregon Wine Board's Research Committee, where we had about 40 of your industry colleagues who meet annually to go through all the proposals. And there was a few minutes spent acknowledging the work that Matt did personally to go re-excavate and improve the grade and the access to Oregon State University's Woodhull experimental vineyard that he pretty much did on his own. There's just not many partners we have in this industry like Peel Excavating and Matt Peel, and we're so pleased and proud to have you as our presenting sponsor. Thank you, Matt. It's my job to keep our program running, and I also want to make sure that I acknowledge, and I hope you experienced, a significant improvement in the ease of the registration process this year. That was the hard work of a lot of people, and boy, we heard your feedback and your frustration from last year, and we felt it on every level. One of the key reasons why we were able to improve that process so dramatically was the sponsorship and support and enlistment of Columbia Bank. Thank you for that, Columbia Bank. Last sponsor I want to make sure I recognize, because these events just simply do not come together without the active engagement and participation of all of our industry partners. I want to make sure I recognize and ask you to join me in thanking our platinum sponsor, Tricor Braun Wine Pack. Thank you for that. We're going to get going here with our program. I want to touch on just a couple real quick things. This year, your feedback is as valuable to us as ever on the event and all the sessions and seminars. This year, however, we're asking, and we've heard your request, that we try to be green and we be responsible, and we're going to have you fill out a digital survey at the end of our symposium. However, if you are averse to that or don't have easy access to an online resource to complete the event survey, there are a limited number of copies of a paper survey right by where you registered if you need those, but we are trying to go digital. I'm also supposed to mention that there is a charging station for your phones and devices in the lounge at the trade show. And I'm also supposed to make sure that those who did arrive early and received a raffle ticket need to turn them in before 5 o'clock tonight. 5 o'clock tonight, we open the wine and we start our industry reception right here on site. And you're supposed to get your ticket in if you're a holder of a raffle ticket and you came early to get one of those. They're due to booth 124 before 5, okay? All right, I'm going to kick it over to our two speakers who always do such a terrific job getting us launched into our two-day event. Christian Miller and Rob McMillan have traveled from California and have been regulars here and always eagerly anticipated and among the highest rated speakers, and we're so anxious to hear what they have to say. You're going to hear them fly through a lot of material because we just had to cram them in, but we didn't want to miss their insights. So I'm going to bring them up now. Christian Miller and Rob McMillan will be up next.
You up first.
I am up first.
Yeah, I get to sit in the comfy chair and watch you.
Gotta have this. Good morning, everybody. I can't tell you how glad I am to be here because on Thursday I had 102 fever. Now, I didn't tell anybody from the organizing committee that I was sick because I knew it would have happened. They probably would have sent an ambulance or something like that. But so if I sniff a little bit, forgive me. And I'm really curious what I have to say today because I'm so high on pseudoephedrine or whatever the hell that stuff is called that I could say just about anything. But I am very happy to be here. Truly, it's one of my favorite shows of the year. I get around a fair amount now. Last year I was in Cuba, and I got to New Zealand and up in the Okanagan. And when I travel around now, it's really a lot of fun to hear people in like New Zealand when I'm talking to them there. And they view Oregon as something to aspire to. This is, New Zealand when it comes to Pinot Noir. Okanagan, same thing. So Oregon has made a brand for itself, and I promised Tom I'd say this, but I said it in the State of the Industry report, that brand really is everything. And we'll have some slides to maybe demonstrate some of that. So moving forward, 2016 was a great year. And one of the things we do is, as many of you know, is we do a survey, a couple of them a year. One, we do wine condition survey in November. We'll have another one coming out in March for tasting room or cellar door. And we appreciate Oregon's participation. We typically get somewhere close to 100 Oregon wineries participating in these surveys that we do. And as you can tell, virtually everybody thought 2016, this is for the industry as a whole, was a very good year. And, as it turns out, Oregon had the best vintage. It was the vintage of the century, maybe. I don't know how you guys topped the last 3 years, but 3 years ago it was the vintage of the decade, and then last year was the vintage of the decade. The year before that was the vintage of the decade. So you're starting to sound like the French. Texas, on the other hand, didn't have a great vintage. They had some rain and stuff like that. So we're starting to survey from some other parts within the U.S. And the West Coast has had a great time. There's no question about it. But life isn't perfect. One of the things we do, it's a little bit like the Michigan Consumer Survey or Consumer Sentiment Survey, is we ask a bunch of questions, and we ask you to say, like as an example, the economy. Does that affect you positively, negatively, or neutral? And then from that, we're able to gauge effectively the confidence of the wineries. So this last year, I thought that we would end up with some pretty positive results based upon the way the economy has been trending for the last few years. And certainly demand is up, and that's the way it is surveyed out. But there are some issues. Life's not perfect. Labor is a gigantic issue across the industry. Another one is foreign competition. That's a fear. We'll talk a little bit about that. Substitutes vis-a-vis craft beer, cannabis, another big one. And then one that doesn't really show up in this data, but it's sales channels, because distribution is still consolidating. Direct-to-consumer is so important right now. And so on a net basis, that still skews positive because direct-to-consumer is so strong, but it is an issue. So what do I worry about? What does Rob worry? I worry about boomers retiring, and they're going to retire because I'm not going to leave any. I'm going to spend it all. But I don't drink as much as I used to, so I worry about that. And we'll show you a couple of slides, not of me drinking, but boomers drinking. Millennials are gaining importance as consumers, but they don't have the means to buy luxury, and that's going to be an ongoing problem. European imports are gaining in importance with the new consumers. And that's a big concern for me. Fighting varietals. Back in the 80s, we came up with the term fighting varietals to differentiate us from European wines that were really hard for the American consumer to understand. And fighting varietals are starting to decline in their importance. Continuing consolidation of distribution, another specific problem that is just leading to additional squeezing at the sales channel end. The growing price of vineyard lands backs up into grapes, and the inability to pass that on to consumers is a big thing. Something that I think we'll see more when we do the direct-to-consumer survey in March is that the direct-to-consumer sales are too localized. And then last, labor availability. I'm not so concerned about cost. I'm concerned about availability. Can we get the labor we need, especially during harvest? So let's go back a little bit, and let's look at what's happened with wine consumption since about 1984. Well, exactly 1984. And by 1994, you can see we hit the bottom. Why is that an important data point? It's an important data point because in 1994, the median boomer hit 35. And we're going to talk a little bit about cohorts in this presentation, but what's important to recognize is that the consumer spend in their years between 35 and 55, that's when they always survey the highest spending. And it makes sense. When you're 35, maybe you've started your family, having children, establishing your career, many things that happen that help make you a good American. You know, buying a lot of stuff so that we can have a good GDP. So 35 to 50, by the time you turn 55, you start to say, well, gee, do I have enough for retirement? Your spending patterns start to change. But when you look at this, there are a few flat spots. There's one right there. Of course, that was the tech recession. That's where consumption slowed. And then this is the Great Recession, of course, where we actually had a decline in volume consumption. And then what about this? Look at that change in slope. That's the one that I think we all should be concerned about, because we are starting to see a slowdown in table wine consumption. Boomers retiring. This is one of the things I spoke of. When you look at boomers, this is a slide about net wealth from starting in 2015 projected through 2030 that come from Deloitte. And if you look at in 2015, the boomers had roughly 50% of the net wealth. By 2030, they were projected to have 45%. I thought it would be a lot less, but boomers are living longer. That's also a problem, by the way, for Social Security and the other things. You know, we're leaving that for our children. The millennials are going to have to pay us, even though we're going to take all of our money with us. When you look at the Gen X component, 14% of net wealth, they're going to expand to 31%. Gen X is the growth cohort still, and it's an important component to consider when you're thinking about your marketing. Millennials, 4% of net wealth, and by 2030, only 16%. And of course, that means that the kids will never be moving out. But since they don't have housing to pay for, maybe they will be better consumers, who knows. Millennial myths. Now, there's a lot of discussion about millennials, and it's partly because of the press. Anytime you say anything about millennial or Trump, it gets into the press, it seems like. And when you over the last decade or so, we've talked about the ascension of the millennials. I spoke to the chief economist of the National Beer Association, a guy by the name of Lester Thompson, recently, who told me that they believed that the millennial would save, be a salvation of beer, which has been on a decline for a long time. And in fact, that hasn't been the case. And today, as a matter of fact, beer is, although it's still growing, craft beer is still growing, not total beer. The category is dying. I shouldn't say dying, it's trending down. How's that? But craft beer is now dropped below 10% growth rate for the first time since 2000. So the millennials aren't here to rescue anything. And as a matter of fact, what we have today is 10,000 boomers retiring each day, and they're being replaced by financially disadvantaged millennials. The Gen X in the center are the balance point, and they are growing. We'll show you a slide on that in a second. But that's why we have some of that consumption shift. So this is something I think is worth considering. When you say to yourself, this is good news, why should we expect the new consumer to appreciate wine? Well, it's the way things have been. And when I start to look at the way everybody has consumed wine in the past, boomers, well, we're missing the words on this, so it's a very lovely slide, but it's good that the bottom one's there, because the top one was just as good. So, oh look, there it is. So on the bottom, the boomers, when they started, we drank beer. We drank anything because we were drinking. And we had Bartles and James. We went through White Zinfandel, Chardonnay, Merlot, and then into Cabernet and other varietals. Millennials have done pretty much the same thing. They drink good beer and good wine and everything in college, and just like the boomers did. And then they moved on to Prosecco, Moscato, Sauv Blanc now, and red blends, which are really starting to dominate. And so when I look at Oregon in particular, I say, the boomers who went more to Cabernet and other Bordeaux varietals at that point, why not Oregon Pinot? why not Oregon Pinot for the next stop for the new consumer? And I think there's a good reason to expect that they will do that. I actually believe that Oregon Pinot is squarely in the center of consumer demand, and you should expect great things out of the new consumer. This is part of our survey that we do each year in November, where we survey across the United States, and we ask you, to the extent you track the information, what do your direct shipments look like versus these cohorts? And as you can see, boomers still dominate sales for premium wine. That's just a fact. Matures are, I don't want to say dying off because my mom doesn't like it when I say that, but they're starting to decrease in importance. My mom doesn't like me when I say that either, though. And then millennials, of course, they're up to about 17% in market share for premium wine. And then Gen X, as I said, Gen X is another one of the growth cohorts that should be factored in and marketed to heavily. Again, it's that 35 to 55, and the Gen X is 39 to 50 right now. So they're right in the sweet spot of luxury consumption. What about imports? So this is one of the things concerning me is when we started as consumers, as boomers, we started with U.S. wine, U.S. made wine. And we started at lower price because that's what we could afford. It wasn't uncommon to see a Napa Cabernet for $12 back in the early 90s. Not anymore. And what we're doing right now is you look at most of the Napa market, and they might have an entry point of $45 for Cabernet. That would be on the low end. We're talking $10,000 a ton. That's not the average. The average is, I think, $6,800, something like that. But $10,000 is showing up as a rather normal price per ton for Cabernet these days. So the math says that you got to have a $100 bottle of wine to have that make sense. That starts to price you out of these oncoming consumers. So look at where the growth segments are. It's Italian, French, and New Zealand. And each of those, by the way, are the wines that are being imported. Italian, it's Pinot Grigio. French, it's Rosé. And New Zealand, it's Sauv Blanc. Each in price components that are quite competitive for these new consumers. And when you look at growth in varietals, what you end up with is Cab is still king. It's kind of ruling the roost. And then red blends come out as the second category. And that to me is fascinating simply because what's happening is our new consumers are starting to trust the big wine companies instead of following in the varietal, so do I like Cabernet, do I like Merlot, what year do I like, what's the region? Now they're just starting off with, let's just say, Apothic Red. And by the way, how many people have tried Apothic Red? Raise your hands. You look around, and there's maybe, I'm going to say 4%, something like that. I was challenged the other day by a European expert, and he asked me to try that, and I hadn't tried it either. It's surprisingly good. I drank the whole bottle. That's not surprising, but it is something you should try because Apothic Red is the category leader right now. Isn't that true?
It's certainly one of them. Ménage à Trois's Midnight blend is coming up strong too.
So there's a couple of them, but so try Apothic Red. I think it's worth your time to educate yourself on it. But the new consumers are actually trusting these big wine companies, and so now brand. When I say brand is everything, this is what's happening now. These consumers, they want to trust somebody because they don't have time to sort through all this other very confusing stuff. In the same way that the boomers couldn't sort through the European wine classifications, etc. These young kids have even less time, and so they want an app for it, or they want somebody to help them through it. And now they can trust these wineries to actually produce a wine that's not too bad. Pinot Noir is the number 3 top selling, if you will, top growth category, and Oregon has a big component of that, and Chardonnay after that, and then Sauv Blanc. And again, New Zealand is a big piece of that, Pinot Grigio out of Italy. When you look at the heat map in the segments, it's the $11 to $15 glass bottles. That's the segment that is the hottest right now. Cab Sauv is again, the dominant component of that, but even bigger than that is, for me, the red blends. You look across the red blend category, and you got 59 million of growth and 24 million of growth in those two categories. So that's a substantial and growing trend. Pinot Grigio, again, toward the inexpensive side. Pinot Noir, look, it's priced up there a little bit into up in the $20 and $25. So that's the aspirational consumer. That's really, really good news. Sauv Blanc, again, a lot of that's New Zealand. And then look down the rest of it, Merlot, Moscato, Riesling, not doing so well. And then, by the way, whatever happened to Syrah and Zinfandel as components of varieties, or varietals, if you will. That ends up being in red blends. Matter of fact, if you look at Apothic Red right now, it's a combination of Zinfandel, Syrah, Merlot, and a little bit of Cab. But the bottom line is that all those overplanted spots so that we screwed the consumer up, you go back in time and you think, Merlot is the next hot thing, et cetera, et cetera. We screwed the consumer up by thinking that, we misdefined Merlot, we misdefined Syrah, so it doesn't really have a characteristic that the consumer understands. And again, they're trusting that brand over everything else. I'm going the wrong way. Cohort demand. So when we look at what's happening right now, the thing that's interesting to me, that top piece is the boomer. The bottom piece is the mature. Those two middle pieces are both Gen X, and then this one being the millennial. But I love the shape of these wines because although it's not really a demand curve, let's just call it that for now. What it shows is that the young consumers are skewing. They still have a low-end component of their consumption patterns, but they're skewing up higher. I like the way that looks. And the same thing with Gen X. Gen X, on the other hand, if you look out all the way toward the end of that line, you can see that they're a dominant component as well in the above $69 category. And again, boomers overall lead that. Oregon's satisfaction with wholesalers. We ask, how satisfied are you with wholesalers? And 58% neutral or unsatisfied. That's not a good stat if you're in the wholesale business. You ought to aspire to something more. And I think there's about 3% that said they had seething disgust. So needless to say, there's room for improvement here. Why do we need to go direct? I think everybody knows this, but sometimes these numbers actually are worth looking at again. In 1995, we had 2,600 wineries. We had 3,000 distributors. By the time we get to 2015, we have 8,800 wineries, 9,000 now, from what I understand, and 700 distributors. So we've gone from 1.15 about one distributor per winery, till today we're at 0.08. And distributors are still consolidating, and wineries are still multiplying. So the fragmentation has just caused a need to absolutely move into this direct segment and embrace it. Another problem with sales channels. If you look at restaurant sales for wineries, they're dropping like a stone, and virtually every bit of information I see, with the exception of one data point, shows the same thing. Excuse me. I'm able to see about 60% of the U.S. wine sales through restaurants, through a confidential source, and they're showing all segments in wine in restaurants dropping, except, again, red blends. Small producers are having a really difficult time on premise. So when you look at this, every one of these is year-over-year changes in on-premise sales, sorted out by size of winery. And you can pretty much see that the smaller the winery, the harder it is to get done. And the larger the winery, as a matter of fact, if you go out to about 250,000 cases, that's a segment that's actually doing not so bad. It's because they can find distribution at that part. Not surprisingly, growth in direct-to-consumer sales is up, and this is a comparison of overall versus Oregon. Oregon is, the last year has trailed the market growth in direct-to-consumer sales. In terms of price increases, when we survey, this is a piece of the puzzle that I sometimes will ignore when I do my State of the Industry report, because I think the survey respondents started to figure out that I'm posting this information, and so they want to show that they're going to take these price increases, and owners may or may not be able to. But really, the last couple years, we have seen some price increases, and I do believe, though this is probably an accurate slide, then we should be able to take some very small price increases. And I'm saying small. In some respects, if you want to increase your prices to account for the higher cost of grapes and labor, you almost have to start a new brand in order to do that. So, final observations. Millennials are finally impacting the premium wine segment, and they're trending up into higher prices. Oregon is, I think, perfectly positioned with their value. You know, it's not to say Oregon's cheap, it's to say Oregon has a great value for the product that they produce. Real estate prices up here are far more favorable compared to the north coast of California in particular. And as we see the young consumers trending up through red blends, what do they go to next? And I think Pinot Noir is the natural. I don't think they can afford Cabernet. So Pinot Noir, I think, is where they're going, and we're already seeing that. Like I said, it's the number 3 growth varietal that's showing up right now. And I believe that's what we're starting to see. So I have very high expectations for what Oregon can do, so long as you're not usurped by New Zealand and other producers. Oregon Pinot Noir is positioned perfectly, as I said. Boomers are spending less, but they still dominate wine club sales today. So in your wine club, you have to treasure your boomers, but you have to aspire to those millennials and still sell to the Gen X. Emerging trend: young consumers trusting in brands, not varietals. So think about this aspect in your marketing. You can't just say we have warm days and cool nights and special soils. The young consumer isn't really relating to any of that. They do want the authenticity component. That's critical for their purchase decisions. I do think that they'll get there. I think that they'll become consumers much like Gen X at some point. But there is a question to me whether they branch off into sticking with some of the blends that the big wine companies are starting to produce and just trust in that because it's a good value, or do they settle back to the other side? We'll have to see. But there's an opportunity, I think, for everybody in this room to establish your brand for those consumers. What does that brand look like? How do you define yourself as being authentic? How do you have an on-ramp for your wine? If you have a little bit higher price point wines, how do you actually reach them? Brand Oregon is continuing its growth. Larger wineries, marketing dollars, KJ is an example. I think that really helps. Labor is the issue that we have to talk a lot about, and it's just hard to pass on these cost increases. We can get small price increases, but not big ones. And then the last part is, since restaurant sales are dropping, since it's hard to get distribution, what's your path to market? Especially before you start a new brand, a new winery, you got to ask yourself, what's your path to market? Because brand is everything. Thanks a lot.
Okay, quick handoff here. I'll try to stick to the script because my foot went asleep while I was sitting there. But welcome to another year of fun with numbers, and we'll do our best to cling to fact-based reality here because, as someone pointed out, what's the alternative? It's not like there are alternative facts out there or anything. So let's move on. Just so you know, I'm not making this stuff up. I pull on the following data sources for this presentation. And just a little shout out to John Marmarco at BW166. He's picked up the Gomberg-Fredrickson report, and he's doing some nice work sorting out stuff like cider from the under 14% data and pulling out the actual fortified from just the big table wines and the over 14%. So that's nice to have someone working on that. First, let's take a look at the long-term sales trend growth, and Rob already covered this, so I'm just going to skip through and point out a couple of things. It really is, the flattening out is something of a concern. If you look here, these bars are annual growth rates for table wine, and it's growth every single year since 1993. Most categories would kill for this kind of growth, but in fact, when you look at the red line, which is a 3-year moving average, the rate of growth is decelerating, and the recovery from each recession, as indicated in the red arrows, is also slightly less each time. And you might say, well, of course, the wine growth is, approaching saturation. It's much bigger than it was, so maybe it's a natural flattening of the curve. But there's other data showing from other sources that marginal wine drinkers aren't converting to high-frequency wine drinkers in quite the same proportions they were in the late 90s and early 2000s. So there's some category level concern there. On the other hand, it's happy news on the sparkling wine front. This is the percentage change per year in sparkling wine sales in the US, shipments into the market. And you see the boom, pre-millennial boom and the post-millennial bust, and then several years of really kind of moribund growth. And then suddenly around 2010, things really take off. And this growth is actually spread pretty well across all the categories. Prosecco, Moscato, Pink, and Rosé are the leaders, but most categories of sparkling wine are actually up. And what's kind of exciting about it is that the Prosecco and Moscato growth is to some extent being sourced from relatively new to the category consumers, not just people adding on purchases or switching from other things. So that's an interesting category right now, and certainly one to watch. Let's get into retail detail. This is Nielsen retail scan data, as are the next few slides, all from the estimable Danny Brager at Nielsen. This covers retail store channels, grocery chains, etc. It doesn't include on-premise, and it underrepresents fine wine shops, plus some distinctive big chains like Costco and Trader Joe's. But it really is the most fine-grained and complete picture of the retail sales we have. It covers about 50% of them. And we're looking right here at scan sales by domestic region versus imports, and lo and behold, great year for Oregon, and this is the kind of thing I've been hoping for to see as Oregon wines get more out into the general wider visibility and better distribution. The consumers are obviously responding, and as you're going to see when we get to the consumer research, continuing this trend is a key component for growing Oregon. These are scanned retail sales by price segment, and what you can see is there's a clear bifurcation between the inexpensive wine and the pricier wines. The transition from negative downturn, decreases in value of, for instance, under $3.99, reach $7.50 equivalent, is down 3% in value and 3% in volume. Then around the $8 to $10 point is when things turn around. You start to see positive growth, and the higher you go up in the price segments, in fact, the higher the growth rates, ranging 10 to 12, 14% in volume in the 11 to 15, 15 to 20, and all the way up to 25 plus. One important caveat here, though. A lot of this growth in price and price segments is being caused by people trading up. Actual price increases on individual wines have been mostly limited to the very low end and the high end. And the people in the middle, that kind of $5 to $15 segment especially, they are not able to raise prices in the current distribution environment. It's because it's competitive and because the buying power is so concentrated. Let's look quickly at sales by variety, and just a few comments. You'll see the trends are similar to what Rob showed there. But the couple of highlights, Pinot Noir still growing very strong in volume and value, and has the highest average price in scanned retail. Now 1016 doesn't seem very big in the context of Oregon, but remember this includes a lot of California appellated, inexpensive Chilean Pinot Noir, et cetera, and it is relatively higher price compared to the other varieties in the scanned world. Rosé, absolutely worth keeping an eye on now. Explosive growth. It is from a small base, but it's now growing into a size where it's actually becoming a category. And while this growth has really been spearheaded by a few strong brands notice the higher price there too, by the way. But the growth has been spearheaded by a few small brands in the sort of the a few major brands in the 8 to 12 segment, and by the Provence Rosé, who have really upped the whole perception of Rosé. But I think it's becoming big enough now that in the next few years we're going to be able to see more niches and segments within the Rosé world. So let's shift gears and look at shipments or sales by Oregon wineries. And this chart here shows sales in cases or shipments in cases by channel according to the OASS and Source annual reports 2005 to 2015. So the green bar there is all direct-to-consumer sales in cases. The yellow bar is shipments either to retail or wholesalers in Oregon itself, and then the pink is all the other states. I've left exports off for now. And what you can see is pretty strong growth. It's another solid year here for Oregon. After a lull in 2014, the direct-to-consumer sales resumed their strong growths. Club and website shipments in particular, as we'll see in a moment, have strengthened. Really a solid appearance all around. I've added some 2016 estimates. These are very rough projections based on interpolation of scan, ship compliant, surveys, taxes, anecdotes, etc. So take them with a grain of salt, although my last year's predictions did turn out to be in the ballpark. Let's take a closer look at those direct-to-consumer sales. This is the share of volume by variety. In other words, the yellow bars are the percentage of Oregon direct-to-consumers that are represented by that variety. And as you can see, Pinot Noir is dominant for Oregon, 55% of all their shipments, much higher than all other states where it's only 14% of shipments. Similarly, red blends is an area where Oregon has been relatively less involved. It's 16% of all states' direct-to-consumer shipments versus 5%. Now, I have to say these are shipments. These are not tasting room takeout numbers because it's coming from the ship-compliant wines and vines database, which I think is the best representative data at this time for club and website and sales and so on, direct from wineries to consumers. The next chart takes this data and turns around slightly different, shows us what is Oregon's share of direct winery to consumer shipments by variety in 2016. And what you see is Oregon is a big deal in the DTC world for Pinot Noir and for Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, with 20% roughly share of those, and increasing actually in Pinot Gris. It's also fairly important for Riesling, although that's slightly slipped a bit with stronger Washington sales direct to consumer. And fairly important for Rosé, sparkling, 5%, but it's rising. So, and for wines overall, it's up slightly at 5%. Okay, this next section is going to cover highlights of a consumer survey we did for the Oregon Wine Board in late 2016. Due to time constraints, I'm only going to cover a few pieces of the research. There's an expanded presentation available as a webinar on the OWB site, and of course a lot more information in the study itself, which is available from the Oregon Wine Board. Just to give you a little bit of background, this research took place in two phases. There was first a qualitative round and then a quantitative survey. And the qualitative round would consist of two discussion groups, extensive online discussion groups. The first group was a group of consumers who are knowledgeable and real Oregon fans and buy the Oregon wines regularly. The second was people who have the wine consumption habits that they should be buying Oregon wines, but actually aren't very familiar with them. And then after that, we ran a quantitative survey using the Wine Opinions National Consumer Panel, which is over 11,000 people now, that represents the roughly 20 million high-involvement, high-frequency wine buyers who really dominate sales or purchases of wine above $15 a bottle in the U.S. And for the analysis, we focused on Oregon's target market, which is high-frequency, high-end wine consumers. People who buy wines over $20 a bottle per $7.50 at least monthly or more often, and who consume wine more often than once a week. And this is just a quick snapshot of their consumer respondent profile. This is very typical of most studies I've seen or participated in for high frequency and high-end wine consumers. How many were Oregonians? Just 2% of the group, so we don't have much home state bias in this group. And what I'm really going to talk about here is they're segmenting them by their familiarity and interaction with Oregon wines here. So just to go through these, we asked specifically the question, thinking about wines from Oregon or any wine regions within Oregon, which of the following statements most closely describes you? Just choose one. And so we have this group of people we call the unfamiliar. They say, well, I've tried few or no Oregon wines and just don't know much about them. That was 15%. Very few say they've tried it and don't intend to do so again for whatever reason. That's very good. First piece of good news, 4%. We'll ignore them for now. I've tried and liked some Oregon wines, but don't buy or drink them often. This is the largest group at 37%. We'll call them the somewhat familiar. And I buy or drink Oregon wines regularly, although I'm not an expert on them. That's the users, we'll call them. Kind of ugly word, but that's the best we could come up with. About a quarter of the people. And then you've got the really hardcore fans. Oregon wines are among my favorites. I'm very familiar with many wineries and varieties from there, etc. And those are called the fans at 17%. And collectively, the core Oregon wine consumers, the people buying most of your wine now, are the users plus the fans. So, unfamiliars. They're rarely or never tried them, maybe even unaware altogether. Why? Well, the overwhelming factor here is lack of exposure and lack of knowledge. What you see is 60% say, well, I'm not familiar, so I don't know which to choose. 53% don't see many where they shop. 43% say they're rarely or never on display, or people don't recommend them. Happily, 44% said, yes, I would buy them more often if I knew which ones to buy. So it really is lack of exposure. Not a problem, perception of poor quality via either third-party endorsements like reviews, or I haven't been impressed with the ones I've tried, or reluctant to try new wines in general. And just to follow up a little bit on that, who are these people? Well, they're actually slightly less upscale. Remember, we're only talking about high-frequency, high-end wine consumers here. So these aren't casual or unsophisticated consumers. They're just unfamiliar with Oregon. They are slightly less upscale than some high-end consumers. They're more Cabernet and Chardonnay-centric. They're a bit less concerned with food pairing and wine pairing and details of the wine flavors. They like their wines more smooth and drinkable. They are more concerned and more reliant on reviews and scores. And they're very familiar with Napa and Sonoma, somewhat familiar with Washington. They just don't know Oregon. So what Oregon really needs to do for these people is give them more chances to try Oregon wines, more visibility in stores, more opportunities with Cab, Chard, red blends, as well Pinot Gris, as well as Pinot Noir, and more enforcement with third-party recs. Let's turn to the somewhat familiar. This is the largest group, remember, and they said, I've tried and liked some Oregon wines, but I don't buy or drink them often. Well, why is that? Again, visibility, distribution, and lack of comfort and familiarity with Oregon choices are the main barriers, not the quality perception, not lack of interest. These people do try new wines. They are curious about wines. You just got to get the Oregon wines in front of them. You do have a small Cabernet-centric group, about 1 in 5, 23%, who say they prefer bigger, bolder wines, but that's not the main hurdle. And who are these people? Well, they're actually typical high-frequency, high-end consumers. They're just less familiar with Oregon wine regions. But these people do like to experiment, and they do like to try new wines. They just don't encounter the Oregon wines much. And here's some actual quotes from the qualitative research. Well, I'm always trying new wines. Or 2 weeks ago, I was looking for a new experience and interested in trying wines from regions I hadn't tried, so I bought 2 bottles from a winery in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, for God's sake. So, these people are up for trying new things. You just got to get the wine in front of them. Oregon wines are hardly visible at all. In a shop in California, where this person resided, they're typically part of a Northwest grouping. Or the stores I go to have a few Oregon wines, but not a lot. Or I suppose the biggest reason I don't choose or try Oregon wines, lack of availability. I would try them if they were offered by the glass. So these people are out there waiting for your wines, just need more opportunities to try them in an informative setting, reminders of the quality, visibility, and distribution. So let's turn to your core clients who drink it regularly, and we ask them on an open-ended basis what they think differentiates Oregon wine. Why are they drinking these wines regularly? And yeah, Pinot Noir is still the gateway to Oregon. Over 1/5 of the people, nearly 1/4, said yes, it's all about the Pinot Noir, great Pinot Noir, etc. Another tier that collectively was pretty close to that, though, was it's got a distinctive regional style. And yes, some of these people actually used the T word. This was an open-end response. We didn't give them a list of attributes to pick from. They were volunteering this off the top of their head. Another group, smaller but still significant, said, related to an old world or earthy or certain Burgundian style. And then another group, substantial but smaller yet, was the whole cool climate, lighter style, tangier, greater acidity, etc. So you've got sort of layers of people who have discovered what they think is unique about Oregon, and that's what's driving this regular consumption. And so who are these people? Well, the fans, the real fans of fans, are a bit different from the people who just drink it regularly. The true Oregon fan, you guys, You can declare victory now on the war for the very high-end wine consumers' attention, because that's exactly what these people are. They buy wines over $30 much more frequently even than the average high-end wine consumer. They do skew male, like the very top end of the high-end wine consumers. They value classic connoisseur things like food pairing, old world precedents, balance, and acidity. They're very serious consumers of Pinot Noir. And interesting, they're more interested in Chardonnay, Riesling, and Tempranillo, and somewhat less interested in Cabernet than other high-end buyers. And most importantly, maybe their first encounters with Oregon wines, they're much more likely to have been quality-focused, kind of intensive occasions. Visiting a winery, attending an educational tasting, a really high-end wine bar, something like that. The regulars who say they drink Oregon wines regularly, but they don't consider themselves expert on it, they're a little bit less high-end, although this is a very lofty group here. A little bit less male, a little bit more like the typical high-frequency, high-end consumer. They're a bit less familiar with Oregon wines and less of an old world influence. They're all about the Pinot Noir in Willamette Valley. They see Willamette Valley as a peer of Napa Valley and Sonoma, and plain Oregon wines they're not quite as sure about, but Willamette Valley and Pinot Noir are absolutely on their radar screen, and that's how they've come to Oregon. So we asked fans, in the qualitative research, well, when did it really click for you? What was the moment where you said, Oregon wines are for me? And I'll just give you a smattering of the flavor for these people. A small local boutique, sadly not there anymore, did a small group tasting of Pinot Noir from several regions, and that's how they discovered it. Well, it wasn't the first time I had an Oregon wine. My first recollection was trying wineries in the Willamette, and we went to Adelsheim, and I'd had their basic Pinot Noir, but now I got to taste all the range of wines and see the single vineyards and so on, and that's when it clicked. In another case, I first tried an Oregon Pinot Noir about 2 years ago. It was on a tap system, and we were a little apprehensive, but we tried the wine. It was really great. It had all these notes of blah, 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 blah. So it really is kind of an intensive, focused occasion, not just like happening to try something from, on an impulse, from a grocery store, or having it, a glass poured for them at a friend's house. The fans really seem to start off or become converted to fandom when it's a focused interaction somewhere. I'm going to make a slight detour to wrap things up to talk about food and wine. And this is a really big deal to our category. Not only has wine owned the food meal occasion for a long time, although the competition is definitely heating up there, but a lot of media coverage, a lot of our winery communications, a lot of our positioning revolves around this whole food wine thing. And I think in some ways we've been really getting this wrong. So we asked respondents, well, thinking about choosing a wine to enjoy with a meal, either at a restaurant, dinner, at home, please indicate the importance of each of these following attributes on the scale of 1 to 7, 7 being extremely important, 1 being not at all important. And these are the top ones ranked by importance. And what you really see here, the key points here, is that a lot of the stuff we spend time, and the Psalms spend time on, the interactions, subtle interactions of matching this flavor with that, etc., that's just not a big focus for people. Knowing the people they're with are liking the wine is the first thing. Balancing the weight of the wine and the meal, either so the wine won't overpower the food or the food won't overpower the wine. If they're matching food and wine, that's their first concern, not the interactions of flavors or acidity, doing this against fats or whatever. And then matching the wine and occasion. This is the part of food and wine matching that I think a lot of people miss out on, is like grand wines for grand occasions, special wines for wine geeks, who are at the table, casual wines for the occasion. No one, no matter how perfect the food matching would be, no one is going to open a really fancy special wine that they've been anticipating for Wednesday night lasagna. They just don't do that. So the occasion in wine should be matched as more important very often than the food. And just to illustrate this a bit, here are some of the things that people told us about it. Well, it's about pairing with the foods we'll be having. That's that occasion thing. Pizza or meatloaf doesn't need the same kind of wine as steak or veal, irregardless of the flavor, acidity, etc. My wife and I have a small selection of wines in a wine fridge that we hold for those really special dinners. For the most part, I no longer match red and whites with a meal. I base it on who's there. What do they like? It's a weekend meal, best friends coming over. That's when I go into the deep in the vault to find the special wine. And remember, these are high-frequency, high-end, sophisticated wine consumers. They're not casual or, uninvolved wine consumers. The wine has to complement the meal, not overpower it. And then what makes a wine food friendly? It's easy, whatever wine you like. So when you combine this kind of attitude and the fact that people's palates are both biologically and psychographically different, you've really got to keep this in mind when we're talking about food and wine. And I think Tim Hanai put it best once. He said, not being aware of these differences in attitudes when it's matching food and wine is like being a shoe salesman and not knowing people have different size feet. So let's keep that in mind when we're talking about food and wine. And with that, time's up. Ready for comments. Okay, so we'll hang out here and kind of squint out at you and see if anyone's out there who's got. Okay, so if you have a question, you can stand up and wave your hand, and people with mics will accost you, and there you will be. I don't think we have spotlights, so you won't, it won't be too embarrassing. Anyone? Yes.
Hi, Michael Adams.
Hi, Michael.
Michael Adams. Hi, Christian. Could you dive down a little bit deeper into the rosé trend? I mean, 45 to 50% growth in the last year, that's extreme. Is it just that they're drinking it year-round now, or what's going on there?
It actually is still fairly seasonal from the data I've seen. It's coming from a small base, that's true. But yeah, I think there's been a breakthrough. I think Provence has done very much with the rosé category what New Zealand did with the Sauvignon Blanc. They've come in at a higher price, established a very distinct style. And I think now going from being sort of, what people who visited Provence on vacation drink occasionally, now it's becoming an actual thing, as you might put it. And I think that's going to open up opportunities for other styles of rosé as it becomes reestablished as a category. I think it's real.
And I'd also add that I see that more moving toward millennial as their palate, again, is maturing. They're moving through red blends, and now they're starting to think about rosés. It's a low-price premium wine. Same thing with Sauv Blanc. That's the part that we're starting to see that growth, and it's a very strong growth, and I don't see it slowing down. I do see it the same as you, though. It's still rather seasonal.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing that someone had a good line about rosé, I thought, is that you remember how the majority of wine now interest in wine is really more towards red and away from white. Well, someone said, it's easy. Rosé is the white wine for red wine drinkers. So I have no data to back that up, but I love the line.
Hi, I'm over here.
Okay, there, hi.
Hi, Jean Yates, Oregon Wine Marketing.
Hi.
Our first speaker, who I think should always take cold medicine before he speaks, because he was very witty, ran by something that just blew my mind, which he said, if you want to raise your prices, start a new brand. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so one of the slides I put out there, it showed what owners wanted to do with price increases, and they thought they could take small price increases. And as I mentioned, I think that's true. In the past, I see that every year. The owners always want to take a price increase. Actually getting there has been more difficult. So today, if you're actually starting to think about, how do you increase your margin? If you have an existing brand in the market and you want to take it from, let's just say, average retail $25 to $32 to account for higher labor and grape costs, you're going to struggle. You're not going to do it. And so it's going to be more effective to actually start a separate SKU. I don't know about, maybe I shouldn't use the term brand, but start a separate SKU. And I was interested to see, this is something I've been saying now for probably the last year or so, and I saw the guy, Roger Navidian, is that how you say his name? The guy from Gallo?
No. But go ahead.
I don't know how to say his last name. But I saw he said the exact same thing just this last week in an article. So I don't know if he's listening to me or he came to the conclusion himself, but his point was the same. It's really hard to raise your price. And so if you actually have to raise your price, that's pretty much what you have to do, is start a different SKU. Thank you, Oregon.
Cheers. Thank you, Oregon.